Hey everyone! Today we're diving into a fascinating topic, the Indo-European migrations. This is all about how a group of ancient people who spoke a language called Proto-Indo-European spread out across a massive chunk of the world, from Europe all the way to India and parts of Asia. These migrations happened over thousands of years, from around 4000 to 1000 BCE, and they played a huge role in shaping the languages we speak today. Now, we don't have written records from back then, but by combining clues from linguistics, archaeology, anthropology, and even genetics, researchers have pieced together how these languages spread. It wasn't just about people moving from one place to another, there were cultural shifts too. Sometimes, new groups would adopt the language of the elite or conquering class. By studying the similarities in languages and how they evolved, we can actually trace back these ancient migrations and get a sense of where these people originally came from. One popular theory is called the Kurgan or Steppe Hypothesis. It suggests that the first group to split off from this Proto-Indo-European community spoke the Anatolian languages like Hittite and Luwian. This happened in the Volga region, which is in modern-day Russia. Then you have the Tocharian language, which ended up in what is now Western China. The bulk of the Indo-European languages, including languages like Latin and Greek, emerged from a group living in the Yamnaya culture on the Pontic-Caspian steppe around 3000 BCE. Different languages formed in different parts of Europe and Asia as these people spread out. For example, languages like Albanian and Greek developed in the Balkans, while languages like Proto-Celtic and Proto-Italic emerged as people moved from Central Europe to the west. Proto-Germanic and Proto-Balto-Slavic formed east of the Carpathian Mountains and later spread across northern Europe. One really interesting part of this story is how the Proto-Indo-Iranian language emerged. It probably came from the Sintashta culture, which was located in modern-day Russia and Kazakhstan. This culture then developed into the Andronovo culture, and from there, Indo-Aryans spread into regions like northern India and Iran. There are some alternative theories too, like the Anatolian and Armenian hypotheses, which suggest different origins for the Indo-European languages. But the Steppe hypothesis is the one most scholars support, although recent genetic research has reopened debates about these theories. What's really cool is that over time, the Indo-European languages have grown to include hundreds of related languages and dialects, spoken by almost 3 billion people today. From English and Spanish to Hindi and Bengali, most of the world's major languages come from this one ancient family. And now, let's talk about the actual development of these languages, starting with the Proto-Indo-European language, or PIE for short. Proto-Indo-European is basically the mother language that gave rise to all the Indo-European languages we know today. After the Anatolian and Tocharian languages split off, what we call late PIE is what's left, and it's been reconstructed by linguists over the years. In fact, PIE was the first proto-language that researchers really dug into and agreed upon. It's like the blueprint of a family tree of languages, and no other proto-language has had as much work put into reconstructing it. Experts think PIE was likely spoken around 3500 BCE, although some estimates vary. The leading theory for where PIE came from is the Kurgan hypothesis, which suggests it originated in the Pontic-Caspian steppe, a region in Eastern Europe. The idea of PIE goes back to the 18th century when Sir William Jones noticed how similar Sanskrit was to ancient Greek and Latin. This observation opened the door to the theory that these languages, and many others, all came from a single source. As we moved into the 20th century, linguists had a solid grasp of PIE, but discoveries of languages like Anatolian and Tocharian really shook things up, leading to even deeper understanding and refinement. One interesting development in understanding PIE was the acceptance of something called the laryngeal theory, which helped explain some tricky parts of the language's phonetics. PIE was super complex. It had a rich system of grammar with tons of inflections, like how we change sing to sang and sung. There were vowel shifts, noun declensions, and verb conjugations, making it a highly structured language. But we don't have any written records of Pi. Everything we know about it comes from carefully reconstructing the language by comparing its descendants, using methods like the comparative method and internal reconstruction. Now, there are a few different theories about what came before Pi, like the Indo-Hittite hypothesis, which suggests that both the Anatolian languages and other Indo-European languages came from an even earlier language called Proto-Indo-Hittite. However, not everyone buys into this theory, and it's not widely accepted. Some also think Pi could be linked to the Uralic languages, like Finnish and Hungarian, which may have shared some common words due to trade between ancient peoples. There's even a hypothesis about a broader, Nostratic family, suggesting that Indo-European, Uralic, and some other language families might all share a common ancestor, but this is largely thought to be the result of borrowing words between neighbors, rather than coming from a single proto-language. And here's a fun fact. Some linguists believe there were borrowings between Pi and other language families like Caucasian and Semitic languages, possibly due to contact in areas near the Caucasus Mountains. For example, words like bull and wine seem to have traveled from Semitic languages into Pi, likely through ancient trade routes. Now, as for the phases of Pi, you've got a few key periods. There's Archaic Pi, which is the last common ancestor before Anatolian languages broke off. Then, you've got Early or Core Pi, which came after Anatolian split but still includes Tocharian. Finally, Late Pi is what gave rise to most of the Indo-European languages we know today. The Anatolian languages, like Hittite, were the first to branch off, making them somewhat of a cousin to Pi rather than a direct descendant. To wrap up this segment, modern researchers have even used some techniques from evolutionary biology to date the breakup of Pi. For instance, Hittite likely split off as early as 4139 BCE, while Tocharian branched off around 3727 BCE. The rest of the Indo-European languages split into groups like Greek-Armenian, Italic, Germanic, Celtic, and Balto-Slavic Indo-Iranian somewhere between 3357 and 2162 BCE. These dates help us connect the linguistic evolution to archaeological findings like the Afanajevo culture, the corded ware culture, and the Syntashta culture. And now let's focus on how archaeology helps us understand the spread of Indo-European languages. So, to get into it, archaeological findings have revealed a ton of cultures linked to the movement of Indo-European speakers. The most important of these is the Yamnaya culture, which we associate with the Pontic Steppe, a region in Eurasia stretching from the Black Sea to the Caspian Sea. This area is often considered the homeland of the Proto-Indo-European people. Now, the big theory about how Indo-European languages spread is called the Kurgan hypothesis, or sometimes just the steppe theory. According to this theory, the Indo-European languages and cultures spread out in several waves starting from this steppe region. It wasn't just a simple migration, it happened over time through migrations and what we call elite recruitment, where local leaders and influential groups took up Indo-European culture and language, likely to boost their own power. The whole thing started around 5200 BCE, when cattle were introduced to the Eurasian steppe. This brought major changes to the way people lived and organized their society. Soon after, the introduction of wheeled wagons and horse riding created a more mobile, pastoralist lifestyle. This was a game changer. Between 4500 and 2500 BCE, several steppe cultures spread out, culminating in the Yamnaya culture, which extended far beyond the Pontic steppe, reaching into both Europe and Asia. The roots of this early Proto-Indo-European culture probably began with the Valence culture around 4500 BCE. By 4200 BCE, steppe herders started moving into the lower Danube Valley, which some researchers think caused or took advantage of the collapse of what's called Old Europe, a set of ancient farming cultures in southeastern Europe. From there, the Indo-European Anatolian branch, which includes the Hittites, likely found its way into Anatolia, now Turkey, by migrating through the Danube Valley. Meanwhile, eastward migrations from the Rapin culture led to the Afonsovo culture, which is often linked to the Tocharian people. This group eventually moved into the Tarim Basin, modern-day Western China. Interestingly, mummies found in this region were initially thought to be Tocharians, but a 2021 study showed they were actually descended from ancient North Eurasians and ancient Northeast Asians. However, it's still believed that the Afonsovo culture brought the Proto-Tocharian language into the region during the early Bronze Age. As for late Proto-Indo-European, this stage is closely tied to the Yamnaya culture, which might have come from both the Eastern Kvalinsk and Western Sredian Wystok cultures, forming around 3400 BCE in the Donvolga region. When it comes to how the Indo-European languages spread through Europe, things get really interesting. The western branches, like Germanic, Celtic, and Italic, likely spread through a series of migrations that followed the Danube River westward around 3000 BCE. Slavic and Baltic languages emerged a little later, with the Middle Dnieper region in Ukraine being a key area for their development. One of the most important cultures in this story is the corded ware culture, which popped up in Central Europe during the 3rd millennium BCE. This culture played a crucial role in spreading pre-Germanic and pre-Balto-Slavic dialects throughout the region. In the east, the corded ware culture gave rise to the Sintashta culture around 2100 to 1800 BCE. The Sintashta people are important because this is where the Indo-Iranian language and culture are thought to have emerged, and it's also where the chariot was invented. The Indo-Iranian culture then evolved further through the Andronovo culture, which lasted from about 1800 to 800 BCE. The Indo-Aryans eventually split off from the Iranians around 1800 to 1600 BCE, with Indo-Aryan groups migrating to northern India, the Levant, and even China. As for the Iranian languages, they spread across the steppes with groups like the Scythians, and into Iran with the Medes, Parthians, and Persians from around 800 BCE onward. Now, what's fascinating is that this whole process of Indo-Europeanization wasn't just about physical migration. According to scholars like Maria Gimbutas, it was more of a cultural transformation than a complete population replacement. The Yamnaya people didn't necessarily outnumber the native populations they encountered, but they came with a powerful combination of military strength, a patriarchal social structure, and advanced technology like horses and wagons. This made it easier for them to impose their culture, language, and administrative systems on the local populations, who Gimbutas refers to as Old Europeans. The Yamnaya people had a hierarchical social system that revolved around male dominance and warfare. They were mobile, lived in smaller villages, and had a warrior class that was reflected in their gods and myths. In contrast, the native Old Europeans had a more egalitarian society with no warrior class or horses. This process of Indo-Europeanization probably happened through what we call language shift. Small but dominant groups, through military or political power, brought about a gradual change in language across larger regions. This is how Indo-European languages spread, not just through sheer numbers, but through local elites adopting the language and culture of the Yamnaya people. For example, in northern India, it's thought that elite Indo-European males established dominance over the local population, leading to a shift in language over time. Similarly, in Europe, when Indo-Europeans spread from the steppes, they encountered existing populations with completely different languages. Some researchers believe that these earlier languages left traces in modern Indo-European languages, especially in agricultural vocabulary, suggesting a blending of cultures rather than a complete replacement. Interestingly, about 30% of modern German words are thought to come from a non-Indo-European language spoken by the indigenous funnelbeaker culture of southern Scandinavia. When Indo-European Yamnaya speakers arrived, they dominated the local population, but some of the original language persisted, especially in agricultural terms. So, rather than a simple one-way imposition of culture, what we see is a complex interaction between Indo-European migrants and the native peoples they encountered. This is further supported by genetic studies, which show that around 75% of the ancestry of people from the corded ware culture came from Yamnaya-related populations. Similarly, people from the Sintashta culture, where the Indo-Iranian languages emerged, share genetic ties with the corded ware people. Lastly, climate change may have played a big role in these migrations. Around 4200 BCE, colder winters forced steppe herders to move into new areas, like the lower Danube Valley. Then, between 3500 and 3000 BCE, the climate in the steppes became drier and cooler, pushing people to adopt a more mobile lifestyle. These environmental changes may have triggered the spread of Indo-European speakers, driving them into Europe, Central Asia, and South Asia.